On the night the king's breath thinned to a dry rattle, Eddard Stark stood in the chamber where Robert Baratheon had loved and fought and laughed himself into ruin. Summer air from the bay crept in through the carved window, heavy with salt and smoke, and stirred the bed hangings like the sluggish wings of a dying bird. Torches hissed and guttered. The wine on the table was half finished, and the boar's tusk lay in a bowl as if it had gnawed the world and finally died of it. Robert's fingers twitched against the blankets. He had grown small. It was startling how a giant could shrink to fit a bed. His hand, that had once closed around a warhammer like a promise, now trembled when Ned laid the parchment beneath it. "Your Grace," Ned said gently, "it is time." Robert's eyes found him, blue as summer, muddied by pain and milk of the poppy. "Ned," he said, the name a sigh, a memory. "Gods, how did we come to this?" "You chased a stag," Ned thought. "You chased your ghosts and they ran faster." "We end as we must," he said. "Your will." The words on the parchment were inked in a careful northern hand. That Eddard Stark be named Lord Protector of the realm until the king's heir came of age. He had written rightful heir, where Robert had murmured the boy's name. Those two words were a raft lashed together in a storm. Robert tried to laugh, came out as a cough. "You always were honest." His knuckles whitened around the quill as he dragged the crooked signature. "You'll do right. You always do right." His eyes drifted to the window, to where the banners caught a night breeze. "The hunt? That cursed pig. Tell my boy I..." Ned closed his hand over the king's, over heat and sweat and old, unkept vows. "Sleep," he murmured. "Rest." Robert Baratheon slept, folded into the poppy's red darkness. In the corridor outside, the quiet had a sound of its own, like waiting. When Ned stepped into the passage, Renly Baratheon was already there, face taut as a drawn bow. He was the breath and color of Robert back when Robert had lived nearer to his joy, but his eyes were sharper, measuring. Behind him were 10 men in green cloaks, knights whose houses owed as much to Highgarden as to Storm's End. Their male side as they shifted. "Lord Stark," Renly said softly, "how fares my brother?" "He sleeps." Ned felt the ache in his leg where Jaime Lannister's folly had broken him and wondered when it had spread to his chest. He wondered when he had grown old. "We have little time." "We have none," Renly said. He leaned closer. "You know what she will do. Do not pretend you do not. She will burn that will. She will set her son on the chair and clip your legs at the knee. Take the boy tonight, Joffrey, Tommen, Myrcella. Hold them. Show the paper to the realm. Or it's a blade at your back by morning." Ned had already refused him once. He had spoken of law, of blood and right, and a man's sworn duty. Renly had given him a look like a man who remembered burning his hand on a kettle when he was a boy. "The law will not save you," he had said then. "You will keep your hands clean and drown in virtue. I prefer to swim." Now the hall smelled of hot tallow and fear. A servant edged past with a wet cloth and looked at the floor as if it might answer him. The torches snapped. Ned heard Sansa's voice somewhere in his mind. "I shall be a queen, father. It would be wonderful." He thought of Arya chasing cats through the keep, of her scuffed knees and the wild light in her eyes. He thought of Catelyn, the curve of her shoulder where her hair fell, the freckle near her left ear he had kissed 1,000 times in thanks for simply existing. He had spoken true to Renly before. Duty had drawn the lines of his life the way frost traced the edges of leaves, and he had kept to those lines even when his heart tumbled against them like a bird at glass. He had supported Stannis in word because the world had rules and the rules had held when his own bones did not. But the world was not following its own rules. It had slipped them like a rider cutting a saddle strap. Ned did not think of seizing thrones. He thought of stopping a certain kind of death. He nodded once. "We do it now." Renly studied him for a beat, and a quick smile broke across his face, startled, almost boyish. "Good," he said. "Good." He moved like water then, his men melting into the shadows with the practiced ease of those who had rehearsed this half a dozen times and expected to fail each of them. Ned sent Tomard to fetch his own men and Ser Barristan to him. He sent Varys a whisper. The hour, the doors to be opened, the guards to be standing elsewhere at the precise moments he needed them to be elsewhere. The spider's birds flew on soft feet. Littlefinger was nowhere to be found, which felt like a kind of answer too. The Red Keep at night was another creature. Its corridors were veined with moonlight, its watchfires like watchful eyes. Even the walls seemed to curve and listen. They went by hidden passages and servants' stairs, the hand limping on his cane and refusing a shoulder. Renly's men flowed ahead, melting into doorways. They came to the Queen's apartments at the turn of the hour when the clocks in the city below tolled over sleeping men like a chant for the dead. Ser Barristan stood at Ned's left shoulder, a shadow of chivalry made flesh, his armor hushed by a pad of cloth. "This is folly," he had said when Ned told him, not as refusal but as the old courtesy of truth. "But the realm is sometimes best served by folly. Have you a plan for if the lion roars?" "Yes," Ned had said, though all his plans were bones under the skin of the night. The doors to the Queen's apartments opened without a sound. Renly stepped through first, the way a man might step into cold water. Ned followed. Cersei's bed was empty. So were the chairs near the window where she liked to sit with a book she never read. But a child's soft snore came from the inner room. "J'offre elle." I sprawled across a heap of blankets, a prince even in sleep, mouth slightly open, hair like spilled gold. Next to him Tommen curled in on himself, cheeks flushed with dreaming. Myrcella slept in a separate bed, a pale arm flung out like a lily laid down by an inattentive gardener. Renly's hand hovered over Joffrey's shoulder. He hesitated. "Gently," he said to his man, as if there were a version of this that could be gentle. Ned crossed to Myrcella first, because she was a child and because something of Lyanna's face, of all the girls that war had robbed, tugged at him when he saw her mouth parted in trust. He put a hand on her shoulder. "Princess," he said softly, "wake." She came up from sleep like a fish rising through deep water. A roll, a frown, her eyes finding his. Recognition flickered. She did not scream. She bit her lip and sat very still. Joffrey woke with a violent start, grasping for a word that was sword and crown and grievance all at once. A hand clamped over his mouth. He bucked and flailed and met Ser Barristan's steady gaze and went very still, as if his body remembered something his mind had not learned. Tommen blinked and whimpered and clutched at Joffrey's sleeve. Somewhere beyond the inner chamber, a door slammed. Cersei's voice came, bright and hard, cutting through the night. "What is this?" She strode into the room in a robe of gold and white with no crown on her head and all the crown's contempt in her eyes. 2 Lannister guards stumbled after her, swords half drawn. The Hound loomed behind them, his scar catching torchlight and throwing it back as if it were the blade. Renly's men moved at once, steel whispering out of sheaths, but Ned lifted a hand. Cersei's gaze hooked on him like a harpoon. "You dare," she said. "I do," Ned answered, and his voice was not loud but it filled the spaces. "Your children are safe for now. You will come with us." Her laugh rang without mirth. "You think you can hold lions in a market stall?" "I think I can keep them from tearing down the city tonight." He did not look away from her. "The king is dying. His will is sealed. When he is gone, we will speak of parentage and of law. Until then, the crown rests in the shade of the Tower of the Hand." "The shade?" She tilted her head, as if to admire the word. "You mean in the mouth?" The Hound shifted. "Your Grace," he said to the Queen without taking his eyes off Ned. His voice had the rasp of old iron. "Say the word." Joffrey was watching Ned now, hatred a boy could learn faster than courage. He tried to wrench free from the knight holding him, failed, and stood very straight instead, face whitening. "You will die for this," he said, spitting through fingers. He was going to be beautiful. He had that in common with knives. "It may be," Ned said, and heard himself saying it as if it were someone else's life. "But not tonight. There are moments that sit like stones in the river of a life. You step on them and they shift the whole current." Ned had not always believed in such moments. He had believed in habits and choices and the steadiness of duty. Yet as Cersei stared at him and the hound watched for where to put his sword and Renly stood at his side with his hunter's patience, Ned felt the river change. It pulled toward a sea he had never meant to sail. Cersei saw it too. Her gaze went to her children, to Barristan, to Renly, and back to Ned. For a heartbeat, something almost human moved behind her eyes. Something like loss. Something like a woman standing in a corridor with her fear and her fury knocking against each other. Then it smoothed out and was a queen again. "Do not bruise them," she said, voice like frost burning off in morning sun. "I will come." They brought her like a guest rather than a prisoner, with no rough hands. The hound matched pace with her and did not look at Renly. Renly did not look at him. Myrcella walked between Ser Barristan and Ned, small chin up, fingers chewing at the edge of her sleeve. Tommen whined once and then remembered he was a prince and swallowed it. Joffrey said nothing, and his silence keened louder than any outcry. The Tower of the Hand had, like the Red Keep, a night personality. It smelled of parchment and old wood dust. In Ned's solar, they put the queen and her children into chairs and gave them watered wine. Cersei would not drink. She looked at the sealed roll of parchment on Ned's desk and her lip tightened. "Where is your little spider?" she asked. "Where is the man who counts the coins he steals from the realm and calls it service? Where are all your tame southern friends, Stark?" Ned took a breath that felt like a decision. "Gone, some of them. I sent Lord Baelish to count his coins elsewhere until this is settled." That got her attention. Littlefinger had never imagined tripping over his own cleverness, but he had. Ned had sent 2 of his northern men with a polite request for the Master of Coin to remain within a guarded suite for the night in comfort and safety, while Ser Jacelyn Bywater was quietly asked to bring his best men from the City Watch to stand at the doors of the Royal Mint. To Janos Slint, the request had been near identical, and the look he had given Ned, offended surprise, had been worth whatever price it would later exact. Barristan stood behind Ned's chair now, a white tree in armor. "My queen," he said mildly to Cersei, and the title caught, because what else could he call her? "You are safe." Cersei gave him a look like a slap. She turned her gaze back to Ned. "When Robert dies," she said, "you will burn papers and pretend at revelation. You will drag a woman into the street and call it justice. It will not make you a king. Roberts will names me protector," Ned said, "and the truth will name me unwilling to be a butcher." He could hear his own voice as water over stones, steady and cold. "But I will be a fence against blood for as long as I can." Protector, the word slithered around Nd Cersei's mouth, not quite becoming a smile. Protector of what? Honor? Your daughter's girlish dreams? The North? Ah, I see it now. You mean to put winter on the throne and call it peace. And you expect the rest of us to kneel and be grateful when our breath fogs inside our mouths. Ned did not answer. She wanted him to heat. He would not give her that. They guarded them through the rest of the night, Cersei and the children and the doors. Dawn, when it came, was not relief but a pale spreading of light that revealed what had been made in the dark. Robert's heart broke with the morning. The soundless moment when breath leaves is all the sounds of a lifetime being called back. The maesters murmured. The serving men wept into their sleeves. Someone began to ring bells in the city below, and the bells of King's Landing were never dignified. They sounded like a flock of geese let loose in a market. Ned stood with the parchment in his hand and with Renly to his right and with Ser Barristan's grave face bearing witness, and said what needed saying. At the noon hour, in a hall hot with bodies, he walked the length of the throne room without any sword at his hip and without limping. The court washed around him in murmur and stink and glitter. He did not like this hall. The Iron Throne had been built in a fit of temper and it still had one. It looked like a snarl made of metal. It looked like something that could not be sat upon without being cut. Cersei sat proud as if she had not slept in a prison all night. Joffrey, chin up, spasms of rage suppressed into a tremor in his jaw. Tommen's face was red in patches. Myrcella's cheeks had gone so pale, he could see the blue thread of veins at her temples. The hound leaned one shoulder against a column. The small council had gathered like crows on a fence. Varys serene, fingering his chain of office. Pycelle nodding like a creaking door. Renly bright and intent. Littlefinger absent and so present by virtue of it. Lord Stark, Pycelle intoned in a voice that seemed to be imitating a greater man's. We grieve. The king is dead, Ned said. The words did not crack. He left these instructions. He broke the seal. The parchment made a small sharp sound the hall swallowed. He read the words. He omitted the name Joffrey where Robert had spoken it, because he had written it as my rightful heir, and because the truth already had its own mouth and did not need his. Cersei rose while he was still speaking. My son is the king, she said, carrying herself the way some women carry swords. Easy, dangerous. We are done with this little play. The hall shifted, people looking to the Kingsguard. Meryn Trant put his hand on his hilt. Ser Aerys Oakheart did not. Barristan stood between them and no one else moved. The truth of a child's birth cannot be wished away, Ned said. He had Varys's paper in his chambers with its patient lineage. Baratheon hair black as a raven's wing down generations as dependable as rain, and this boy gold to the bones of his face. He did not speak names. He did not want to speak names in front of children who had learned to be proud before they learned to be safe. Your Grace, he said to Cersei, and there was the faintest rip in the title. You will be kept in comfort and honor until you do what you never do and act, she said, smile feral and small. Do it then. Finish as you began. Cut what you have to cut. He will never be yours, Stark. With a jerk of her head at the throne. It will chew you. Ned looked at the throne. It looked back. He thought of Lyanna's blue winter roses and of the boy king in the snow of his first winter, hair dark as ravens. He thought of Bran's laughter before the fall, of the sound of water under ice. He looked at the men and women before him who had made peace their word and war their meat. He thought of Stannis, rigid as a spear, lawful as a ledger. He weighed the thought of that man, relentless and unloved, on this chair, and he saw a war as long as a winter night. For law did not move hearts, and too many would die before they agreed to be told. He had written to Dragonstone with the truth and an offer. Come, let us call a great council. He had received no answer but a ship sighted in Blackwater Bay, its rudder trimmed like a blade. Ned put a foot on the first step. He did not want it. In this he was the opposite of most who wanted a crown. Yet the wanting or not wanting was less important than the need. He took another step. By the last will of Robert of the House Baratheon, first of his name, he said, and his voice did not waver because steel did not care if it loved what it had to cut. I am named protector of the realm. The truth of the succession is contested. A war will follow if we do not stop at this moment. I will not be midwife to another slaughter. For the peace of this realm, for the safety of its people, I accept a burden that is not my desire. He turned at the final step. The throne waited like an accident. I will hold the throne, not as usurper, the hall rippled, but as the realm's first servant, until a great council of lords can be called to settle the succession by law and custom. If any man would draw steel in this hall against that, he declares he favors war upon this city. He sat. The throne bit him. A sting along the back of his thigh, a quick rake against his palm as fingers brushed a twisted blade. He did not flinch. He felt a bead of blood slide under his glove and thought, good, it should cost. At first there was only the soft chaos of human sound, like wind worrying reeds. Then Renly, quick to see advantage, was on his knees with bright wordless ease, his men dropping behind him like grass flattened by weather. Varys's head bowed, a neat little incline that signaled both acquiescence and reservations measured by the inch. Pycelle creaked down a fraction, then gathered himself and went all the way, careful to keep his beard from brushing the floor. Barristan drew his sword and presented it hilt first, knelt, and in that gesture something steadied the hall as if a tent pole had been set in the right place. 100 men and women measured the wind and knelt or did not, each statement its own future. Meryn Trant hesitated and finally sank, sullen and slow. Ser Aerys went down smooth, Ser Boros Blunt made a show of reluctance and then knelt when no one joined him in rebellion. Cersei did not kneel. She stood with her chin high, and Joffrey stood with her. Myrcella's knees wanted to go. Ned could see the tremor in them. Tommen looked at his mother and at the throne, and his lips trembled, and he looked at the floor instead. The only safe ground in a room full of sharp edges. "Your Grace," Ned said to Cersei, and the words tasted like a different kind of iron. "You and your children will remain here under honor guard. You will be treated with every courtesy. If you attempt to leave the city, I will consider it an act of war." "Then let it be war," she said at once, almost lightly. "You think yourself a fence against blood, Lord Stark? You have put the pen in the wolf pen and called it a garden." Later, in the quiet of his solar after the hall had emptied, after oaths had been sworn and torn, Ned looked down at his gloved hand and saw the small tear in the leather and the bead of blood that had seeped through and dried like a seed. He did not drink. He did not pray. He stood at the window and watched the city marinate in rumor. Bells rang as if to drown each other out. The gulls pivoted on the tide winds. Renly came to him like a stag backlit by a forest fire. "You've done it," Renly said with something between admiration and relief and disbelief. "I did not think you would. I did not think I would," Ned admitted. His words made a simple bridge between two shores. "But here we are." Renly smiled quick. "Here we are." He leaned on the sill, gaze sliding over the city. "You've angered everyone worth angering. My brother will write letters that could brand wood. The lion will roar in every corner of the realm. The Reach will hold its breath to see which way the wind blows. The Vale will pretend it never left its mountain. The Riverlands will bleed. The North will come." "The North will come," Ned said softly, the truth a quieter thing than any threat. He sent ravens. To Winterfell, a summons. To Riverrun, a call for patience and for men. To Oldtown, for a maester with no love of Lannister gold. To Dragonstone, an invitation to speak among men instead of letting ships speak for them. To Highgarden, a proposal written in careful, spare language. Peace might be bought with marriages when spears were too expensive. Willis Tyrell was a good man by all accounts. Sansa could be happy in a garden if there were honesty there. He sent a letter to his wife with the part of himself he had always saved for her. No state sentence, no hard words, just the truth of the tide he stood in and a request for her wisdom. He replaced Janos Slynt before nightfall. Slynt had stiffened like a dog who senses a kick even as he bowed, and that was enough. Ser Jacelyn Bywater took the gold cloak command with a face like a bar of iron and the kind of honor that reads as simplicity and is, in truth, a series of choices hard as any blade. Littlefinger found himself under quiet guard at his own table and managed a laugh about it, lightly spoken with a coiled wrist. It was the kind of laugh that placed bets. When the first raven came from Dragonstone, Stannis' hand was obvious. The letters soot-black and the words knife-clean. "You have set yourself above the law," it said. "Yield the throne to its lawful claimant and face judgment, mitigated by your past service." The second letter came not by raven but by ship. A lean vessel out of the island's harbor that anchored just beyond the lines of the royal fleet and lit no lanterns. Varys, who always had a way of knowing things like tides and the price of onions in 3 distant cities, said a loyal Stormlands lord had slipped it mooring under Night's sleeve. A third letter followed, a little singed around the edges, though no one would say it had ever been near a candle. "Beware the Red Woman." Ned called his council and was startled to find himself presiding over men who had decided, suddenly and all at once, to be careful. Renly talked too much and quickly. Varys spoke slowly and not at all for 3 sentences of his meaning. Pycelle Wee's sense and nonsense interleaved like threads. Barristan's counsels were like the songs of old time, what a knight should be and what a man must do. The hand of Littlefinger was on none of it, and the gaps where his cynicism would have slid were clean. It felt like walking in a house after a long winter, when you know which boards will creak and they don't, and the silence is almost ominous because of it. "Stannis will not yield," Ned said, "and neither will Cersei. If there is to be peace, it will be made rather than found. The Reach, Lord Renly, you know them. Would Lord Mace countenance a marriage if it meant a seat in the peace that follows instead of the right to be first in a war? Renly rolled the thought in his mouth like wine. Lord Mace will countenance anything that lets him carry his dignity like a banner. But it's not Lord Mace you must seduce. His mother is sharper than the knives at one of her feasts, and his daughter, Marjorie, is a net in the shape of a girl. They will want to place a queen. Failing that, they will want to place a scent of roses on whatever sits the throne, to prove it was ever their garden. "I do not need a queen," Ned said, and the words felt like a stone set into a wall. "I have a wife. I would not put a rich girl into my bed to buy a field's worth of spears. But I would make my daughter a lady of their gardens if she wished it, and if it spared thousands the pox of war. Varys, send our friend at court in Highgarden the terms. Ma, Margaery can be queen elsewhere. Willis can make Sansa happy if he is the man you imply he is." "I imply no such thing," Varys said with a small, amused lift of his eyebrows. "I imply only that your proposal will plant a seed. Whether it grows is the garden's business." They were interrupted by Sansa. She came in pale with hope and fear, with her hair brushed until it shone and her eyes enormous. She walked to Ned's chair with the careful grace she had learned like grammar and stopped a pace from him. "Father," she said, and the word was a plea and a title. Must I still marry Joffrey?" Ned had told the truth so often it had become the best his mouth knew how to do. He found suddenly he wanted to lie, just once, to spare her, but lies had made this world. He lacked the practice. "No," he said, "you will not. He is not your betrothed. I have made that promise null." She breathed out like someone who had held breath down where it hurts. Then she looked at him, and her mouth trembled, and he saw something ruinous in the set of her shoulders. "I wanted to be a queen," she whispered, and it was not petulance. It was a girl speaking a wish that had been half her bones. "I dreamed of it. I would have done so much good. You will still be a lady in a hall where everyone must come to you," Ned said, watching her face and feeling something break in him at its small shifts. "You will be yourself. If a garden calls you lady, it may be a better title than a city calling you queen. And it may keep you safe." Safe, she tasted the word. But not special. He surprised himself by smiling. The thing about genuine things, Sansa, is that they are the opposite of special, common as bread, durable as wood. You will not be special. You will be true. I have begun to think that is wiser. "What of Arya?" she asked suddenly, and both worry and long habit of resentment warred in her voice. "If I must go to a garden, she will run into the river." "She will run into the river whether or not you go to the garden," Ned said dryly. "But she will come out of it again and be herself. I have it in mind to ask Syrio Farrell if he will consider teaching young ladies to dance in the Winter City of the North. It may be that Winterfell has need of such dances." Sansa blinked. The shadow that always lived at the back of her eyes now, after months in this city, thinned. Truly. She bowed stiffly because she had practiced bowing and not hugging. He watched her leave and wondered if he had ever learned the right way to be a father anywhere south of the neck. Arya came in that afternoon as if she had been thrown by a storm through the door. She had dirt on her cheek like a badge and a cat hair in her sleeve. She looked at the blood-rusted thorn on his hand where the throne had pricked him and grinned, suddenly feral. "Did it bite you?" she demanded. "Did you bite back?" "Something like that," Ned said. "I wish I could bite it," Arya said. "I wish I could cut it into pieces and feed it to the rats." "You and half the city," Ned said. Her fierce laugh was a kind of bomb. War came like weather, not like proclamation. It came in raiding bands along the riverlands, fire in thatched roofs and smoke stitched against the sky until every sunset was an accusation. It came in letters that smelled of wax and threat, and in ships that came nosing into Blackwater Bay like wolves sniffing a fence. It came in a storm lord's ire and in the patient, poisonous maneuvers of the West. Tywin Lannister struck first, because of course he did. If he was surprised by the Queen's capture, he did not show it. And if he was angered, he poured it into the work to be done. The rivermen bled and cursed, and the cry for the king went out across the tumblestone and up the forks, and Riverrun's banners unfurled like remembrances. Caitlin Tully read Ned's letter by lamplight in the Eyrie, tore it once and then set the pieces carefully together again and smoothed them so it would not look as if she had ever lost her temper in the same room as Lisa. Tyrion Lannister, freed by the Mountain's court from a noose he did not deserve, rode south with a Sellsword whose humor was the opposite of fine and thought about fathers. He did not yet know which banner he would be under when he found one. In Winterfell, Robb Stark took his father's summons like a man takes a sword from a rack that has always been waiting for him. He placed a hand on his mother's shoulder and felt both the weight and the weightlessness of the moment. A boy and a lord and a son in the same skin. The lords of the north came at his call like tidewater, reluctant and inevitable, pulling in driftwood and men with old grudges. Great John Umber bellowed in the hall that they should take the crown of their own cold kingdom and leave southerners to roast on their iron chair. Roose Bolton smiled and said nothing, weighing the air. Meage Mormont, too thin and too hard and too proud, said only, "We follow our liege," a sentence made of iron nails. Robb's hand tightened and then released. He would go south, and the north would ride with him, not to make a kingdom but to keep a father. Ned's new court was a fragile thing, like a bridge of ice in spring. It held because people wished to cross it more than they wished to fall in. Ser Jacelyn Bywater kept the city watch a blade's length from any purse thicker than a man's conscience. Barristan Selmy drilled the Kingsguard as if they were real again. Varys oiled hinges and counted whispers. Renly gathered smiles and sent them like arrows. To the Reach, to the Stormlands, to rooms where women made kings by deciding when to open doors. Cersei watched. She watched Ned and Renly and Varys and Barristan. She watched the guards who could be bought and those who could be bullied and those who could be neither. She smiled at Ned across rooms and sometimes almost genuinely, as one soldier to another, and then let the smile cut him when he least expected it. She spoke to her children in low, fierce voices and taught them the art of not yielding the truth even to their own blood. She wrote letters in a slanting hand. She did not weep. When a maid brought a tray of pomegranates to her and pried at one and asked if the seeds should be scattered in the sugar, Cersei plucked out a seed and crushed it between finger and thumb and watched the red bloom on her skin, and the maid went away with her heart beating very fast. It was in the second month of Ned's reign, if that was what this thin, uneasy state was, that Renly rode through the city gates with 50 knights and twice as many retainers and no apology. He left that evening with twice as many, most of them men who liked the way the Reach smelt after rain. Ned did not stop him, because stopping him would have meant breaking something he was still pretending could be fixed, and because the city was a sword in a sheath of straw. A rider to the Honeywine ran a message hard. Marjorie Tyrell was to be a queen after all. Stannis answered Ned's invitation to talk by burning Edric Storm's old wharf on the outer harbor to watch the flame and see if R'hllor approved of it. He sent Davos Seaworth to deliver a letter he had already copied to every lord with a raven that would fly for him. Your wolf has proclaimed himself king. He is a traitor twice, once to his friend, once to the law. Turn your banners or you are traitors thrice. Davos delivered it with a face that looked tired of conveying other men's righteous fury. He had the decency to ask Ned to meet him in a small dockside house with one candle and nobody else. Ned went because men met in rooms like that to start wars and sometimes to keep them from starting. I am not a king, Ned said, when the Onion Knight had finished reading and finished looking as if he were apologizing for reading. I am a better man as a steward than as an owner. I will give the throne to a great council's choice when the realm can hear itself think. Stannis is rightful by strict law. The law will not seat him here without emptying half the realm out first. Tell him this. I will step aside when he swears to take the chair as a servant rather than as a scourge. Tell him I will kneel when the lords kneel, if the lords choose him. I do not tell my lord to bend, Davos said, and it was not insolence. It was the raw fact of a man who had chosen his king and would not sell him for bread. I will tell him what you have said. I will tell him what you have done. Tell him that it would cost less to speak to a man than to burn his city, Ned said. Davos inclined his head. He will count that cost, he said. He will pay it or not. I have not known him to change his measure for a different scale. Then we will meet him on the water, if water is where he lays his road. Davos's eyes were kind. A hard road, he said. You will need good oars. They bought good oars. They bought them with promises and with rare decency, for which men could be as cheap as coin if it were offered with a clean hand. Haleen the pyromancer came to Ned with a proposal sweet as honey and stinking of graves. Wildfire in abundance, jars like beehives full of liquid green. No, Ned had said at once. Haleen had blinked, and the blink had the weight of a century of men saying yes to whatever promised them unearned advantage. I will not bathe my city in that, Ned said. Keep your jars for someone who has made peace with burning his own house. Yet when Stannis' fleet rounded Massey's Hook and came like a dark forest on the sea in the gray light of a morning that smelled of salt and inevitability, he stood on the walls with Barristan and with Ser Davos's warnings in his ears, and he tasted fear like copper. He had placed scorpions along the river and great pots of pitch and hidden bricks of oil-soaked cloth. He had ordered the chain they used for boom defense of the harbor dragged from its warehouse and slung between towers in a rough imitation of an old knight's trick. Only this chain was too short and too weak to hold a fleet and would have to content itself with prompting caution in men accustomed to impatience. He had more men than he had thought he would have had a month ago, fewer than he needed. He had letters from the Reach and from the Riverlands and from Winterfell with positions and arguments and love. He had nothing else. The first stones took the first ships. It is always a surprise the first time you see war at a distance. It moves slower than the stories. Ships do not explode. They heave, they splinter, they groan like men. The scorpions spit their iron through the mist. The grapnels caught. Barristan, calm as a man looking at the year's harvest, called for adjustments to angles and for more pitch. The Hound, who had come up to the wall as if casual, leaned his elbows on the parapet and squinted at flame as it licked along one deck. He smiled with his mouth and not with his eyes. "Your Grace," he said to Ned without moving anything but his lips. "You're bleeding." Ned looked down. The cut on his hand had reopened. It was not much. It made itself important in his awareness, as all small pains do when larger ones are still far off. "Thank you," he said. "Plenty more where that came from," the Hound said cheerfully, and loped down to where the gate guard were already itching for their part. The first real fire came when a barge with innocuous cargo drifted out from a small quay near the King's Gate, as if misplaced in the fog. Stannis' captains had eyes. They saw it too late. When it burst, it was not wildfire, but the explosion shook the wall like a hand shaking a shoulder. It was pitch and oil and black powder bought from Myrish smugglers at a price that made Ned's teeth ache. It went up with a roar that made the gulls drop out of the sky and spread across 3 decks like a dark flower opening and gone. Men screamed. Barristan smiled, a very small, very old smile that meant not joy but relief that an ugly thing had spared him the uglier one. The clash at the mud gate made a sound like thunder rolling down a canyon of iron. Stannis' vanguard put men to walls like it was nothing. Their ladders climbed fast and clung hard. They were men of discipline and wrath, and the ramparts inside King's Landing learned both. The Hound fought like a man who had made his peace with a god of knives. Ser Aerys and Ser Preston and Ser Boros held flanks and gave ground and took it back again. The Gold Cloaks fought better than they had ever fought when they had been fed like dogs, because Ser Jacelyn had given them pride and because their wives and children were behind them for once and not some lord's honor. Ned went where a king should not go and where a man could. He let Barristan set the line and stood at it with a blade he had not drawn in earnest in a while. The first man he killed was a boy with a beard trying to grow. Ned thought of Robb and cut again because thinking was luxury. In the 3rd hour, a ship with the Florent Fox on its sail came abreast of the fish market, and the men on it cheered as if the city had already folded into their pockets. The chain at the mouth of the river sagged and caught and then gave way with a shrug. The fog had thinned. It lifted to show more masts than Ned's stomach had room for. On the wall, a boy beside Ned retched and called for his mother, and then stood up very straight and shot an arrow into the eye of a man who was about to kill him. The man fell off the ladder with grace like a fish. Ned looked at the boy. The boy had tears on his face and no room in him to be ashamed of them. When the Reach banners broke the western haze, They looked like a mirage, green blooming out of light. For a heartbeat, the wall held its own breath. Then the cry that rolled along the ramparts had the pleasure in it that men get when the world snaps into the shape they had hoped, however briefly. Tyrell sails took Stannis' ships on the flank with the eager intelligence of men who had rehearsed. Renly had ridden to Highgarden, and all the Reach's politicking had been cut clean by the same force that had cut it before. A knife that left a king in his tent with a voice in his chest that was not his. Renly was dead by then, throat open or heart stolen or however else men told that story, and Mace Tyrell had decided on peace, which was to say, on whatever kept his gardens intact. Ned's letter and Willis Tyrell's quiet approval had given the Reach something to call decency, as they did what they did best, showing up when it mattered only because it mattered to them. The Tyrell fleet hit hard. It hit gloriously. Stannis' captains did not run. Davos Seaworth saw the green coming, read it like a book, and turned the best of the king's ships not toward flight but toward a narrow line where a path still lived. The Baratheon antlers were stubborn. It was a near thing. In the end, stubbornness cannot stand against more men and more fire forever if luck has driven to the other hand. A Florent ship smashed itself bow first into the embankment and men spilled onto the quay like ants. Barristan's line held. The Tyrells drove the outer flank like a scythe through barley. The barges burned and the river stank and the city did not fall. After, when the day had curdled into a sunset like a wound, Ned stood on the wall with pitch in his hair and ash in his mouth and watched smoke make strange clouds of the sky. The hound sat on a toppled merlin and gnawed a pear like it had personally offended him. Barristan took off a gauntlet and flexed his hand. The knuckles were white and weeping where a cut had opened under the glove and made itself proud. "You were very brave, your grace," Barristan said mildly to the king. He meant it. Ned had lived long enough with honest men to know when they told truths that would be better as comforts but were not. "I was very fortunate," Ned said. "That too," Barristan admitted. Varys appeared with a face that had turned lemons into something drinkable. "Your grace," he said, "the small folk sing. It is mostly lewd but on key. The story has already grown that you stood atop the gate and struck a man's head off from 3 paces with a single stroke. I have it on good authority that if we leave it a day, you will have struck 3 heads off at once." "I hope they spare the poor man a neck," Ned said, tired in a way that felt like the marrow had been emptied out and replaced with the sound of bells. "Where is Stannis?" "Gone." Varys's mouth pursed. "Not finished, dare I say, but gone. Someone has told him that fire can be patient." "Someone told him that long ago," Barristan murmured. Sansa came to him that night with clean bandages and a look of solemn use. She had rolled dressings, pried a splinter from a guardsman's palm, held a basin while an old woman vomited blood. She had not fainted. She had not squealed. She had become serviceable in one day's war in a way that courtly grace had not made her. "Father," she said, and drew his hands into hers without asking if she might. Her fingers were cool. She wrapped the cut with neat, beautiful care. He watched her bend over his hand and thought of Cat under a long-ago tent with a babe mewling at her breast and thought, "The world is too large for a father to keep safe." Then he wondered if this was the first true thought he had had since he sat on a throne of knives. "You may be a rose lady," he said softly, "but you will have thorns." "I had to willow a boy's arm," Sansa whispered without looking up. "I held him down while Maester Pycelle set the bone. He screamed into my hair. I will not wash it tonight. I think if I do I will forget his sound, and I don't want to forget it. Is that wicked?" "No," Ned said, throat tight. "It is merciful." The city slept fitfully, then, for the first time in days. Men who had fought dreamed of water running you. Ender ice, and of women who had smiled under eaves, and of blood that had been someone else's, and of bread. In the queen's rooms, Cersei sat very straight with a glass of wine she did not drink and said to Joffrey in a voice like a nail hammered carefully into wood, "You do not cry," and Joffrey said, "No, mother," and they both stared at a candle until it guttered. Tommen snored softly, a boy's last grace. Myrcella lay awake and counted backwards. In the west, Tywin Lannister read the reports of the day with eyes like a candle in a room where all the other candles had been snuffed. He said nothing to the man who had brought the paper. He said nothing for the space of 3 heartbeats, and then he said, "So be it." He told a servant to send for all the men with any capacity to count, to build, to kill. He had lost a queen, not that he had ever had her. He had lost the shock of the early move. He would not lose the game. At Dragonstone, Melisandre smoothed her hands over coals and saw in them a wolf whose fur had been singed and his eyes alight with the reflection of a fire he hated. "He has taken the fire into himself," she murmured to Stannis, and Stannis did not trouble to hide his contempt. "That does not make him the Lord's woman," he said. "It makes him a thief." "He will give it back," she said, and smiled a little, as if she had a private joke and had not yet decided if she would share it with the end of the world. Dorne wrote a letter to no one and to everyone, declaring they would meddle only if meddling preserved their peace and their pride. It was a complicated letter. The Vale sent nothing. It had closed its shutters at dusk and would open them when the others were done shaking the house. In the Iron Islands, a man with a mouth that tasted of salt and magic laughed into a storm. Winterfell sent Robb. He crossed the Twins with coin and courtesy because war is easiest when you can walk over other men's bridges without needing to set them on fire. He rode down the Green Fork with banners snapping and with a wolf that had grown for months on stories into a beast whose teeth were simply white and large and present. He met a Lannister raiding party near the Red Fork and learned that the first time your men look to you in the first breath after the first charge is the moment a boy becomes a commander or fails at it. He did not fail. He drove them, and they bled under the will of a boy whose face had gone the kind of still that is the same as a scream but makes better decisions. At Riverrun, his grandfather had him to table and told him stories of when he had been a young lord full of rage and had learned patience by breaking his knuckles on the wall until the wall had told him nothing at all needed to be done to favor it with his blood. Catelyn watched her son and the men who watched him and thought of the shape war makes in a life. She put her hand on Robb's hair and then took it away, because he was a lord now and lords do not have their hair smoothed by mothers in front of vassals. She rode south with him, because sometimes a lord requires a mother as his counselor more than he requires 10 men with swords and less judgment. At night, when the campfires ate the edges of the dark, she read Ned's letters and let herself feel things that had no place when the sun was up. In one of them he had written only, "I did it for the realm, cat." This was not a comfort and she had not wanted a comfort, but she folded the paper and touched it to her mouth and put it near her heart because love collects in such gestures like dew, even when the air is dry. Littlefinger slipped out of his guarded room by the simple method of making one of his guards rich enough to change his name and the other poor enough to leave his post to try to fix that. He rode first to Rosby and then to Stokeworth and had 3 different conversations that led to 3 other conversations and made a web so pretty it could have been silk. He did not yet decide which fly to eat first. He was still tasting the air. He told himself that he missed the king's good, plain honesty, but only because he missed how easy it had been to count men when they were arranged in columns of law. Joffrey purchased a knife. He kept it under his pillow and drew it in the night and practiced stabbing into featherbeds with a precise, repetitive motion. Tommen asked if he could have a puppy when the war was over. Myrcella took up embroidery and pierced a thumb and did not cry. Cersei stood before a mirror with her hair loose and her face bare and convinced herself she recognized the woman there. It was easier to be a myth. Ned held court. It was mostly ugly work. Salt prices and boundary disputes, and a girl who had fled a man who owned her with words he had bought. He decided against a lord 3 days in a row and in favor of a fisherman and a baker and a tanner, and the small folk began to call his justice Winterstern and decent. He sent men to the Riverlands to aid Beric Dondarrion again, this time not as a gesture toward empty royal dignity, but because fire had been set and needed putting out. He wrote to Robb and told him to draw near to Harrenhal and not to be tempted into grand gestures that looked like songs. He wrote to Tywin Lannister and offered terms that tasted like ash. Return your outriders, call back your dogs, and come to the Great Council under truce, or see your legacy measured in grave dirt. Tywin did not write back. He was not a man who believed in letters except as an excuse to sharpen knives. Farrell trained Arya on the terrace above the small hall with lengths of willow under a sky that had learned to be clear again. He told her of bravos and the blue sail of the Titan's shadow and of men who walked with their feet so quiet they did not disturb the dust. He put a coin in her palm and closed her little fingers over it and said, "When you must cross the water, you give this to a man and he will carry you." Arya stood and 1 foot on the wall and tried not to think of water at all because water meant leaving, and leaving meant being sent where other people wanted, and Arya had learned to dislike that word. When the invitation to the Great Council went out, it did not go with the majesty of old royal declarations, heavy with bold letters. It went like a man placing stones in a river, one after another, until the crossing presented itself. Davos carried 1 set. The Tyrells carried theirs wrapped in linen and smiles. The Martells dispatched a messenger who could ride 3 days without food. The Vale took a month to decide to read theirs. The Iron Islands never pretended they would bother opening the envelope. It took shape slowly. Harrenhal was too cursed, Old Town too far, King's Landing too poised. In the end, it would be Bitterbridge because it was near enough to mean something and peaceful enough to insult nobody. Ned sent his regrets. A king at his own infancy could not leave his cradle to allow wolves to nose around in his keep. He would send men who could be his words in other mouths. Barristan for honor, Renly because he would be there anyway, Catelyn because she was a Tully and a Stark and had a way of stepping into rooms and making all the nonsense there ashamed of itself. The night before they left, Ned walked the Godswood of the Red Keep. It was a poor thing, a southern man's imitation of a northern truth. A few trees hunched as if embarrassed to be indoors and a pool that had to be skimmed twice a week to keep its scum from looking like a sermon. He stood before the weirwood whose face someone had carved in an age when hunger had made them careless and closed his eyes and listened for a sound he had always once heard in Winterfell without having to ask for it. Wind in thick leaves, the breathing of snow in branches. He did not hear it. He heard, instead, water and the city, forever gnawing its own bones. "Let it be enough," he said into the kind of silence that gives nothing back. When he turned to leave, he found Varys already in the shadow of a tree, as if he had grown there like fungus. "My king," Varys murmured. "Varys. The great lords will go to bridge a river and build a city on top of the bridge," Varys said. "And you will be here. Someone must be," Ned said, "or everything loose in this place will decide to move." "It will anyway," Varys said. "Yet I approve of your stubbornness." He leaned his head. "A word of caution. Peter Baelish leaves small, clever presents in other men's houses. If you find one that bites, do not pretend you did not know where it came from." "I will not," Ned said. "I will pretend nothing if I can help it." He paused. "You have served 4 kings." "Have I?" Varys asked brightly. "I had not noticed." "Tell me the truth, Varys." "I tell only one," Varys said with unexpected weariness. "That the realm is a sack we put our lives in. I am told that in the north you can mend a sack properly. I have never seen it. I would like to." When Catelyn reached Bitterbridge, the Reach had already made it a garden. Tents were pitched in careful crescents. The banners made a field of heraldry that would have pleased any painter and terrified his patron for the cost of the pigments. There were baked eels and songbirds and a stag roasted whole, and there were councils behind curtains where men ate bread and divided lands they did not yet possess. Stannis came with a face like a closed door. Renly's pavilion had been taken down with careful piety. Mace Tyrell presided over everything with oaths of compassion sounding like the tally of old debts paid. Olenna sat under an awning, fanning herself, and watched everyone with an expression like a cat's. Amused, bored, knife ready. Catelyn spoke. She spoke to Stannis of law and of winter and of mercy. He spoke to her of principle, as if principle were a blade you laid on a whetstone and it told you when it could kill again. She spoke to Mace of daughters and of gardens and of the things mothers know. He spoke to her of rosters and of men who owed him favors, many of whom had died and were therefore not as useful as they once had been. She spoke to Olenna of girls and of blood and of what men do in the name of these things. Olenna spoke to her in return of bread and of hunger and of being an old woman who still had all her teeth and what she had had to do to keep them. "You are here because your husband would prefer to be a decent man somewhere," Olenna said without malice. "We all prefer something. I prefer a lemon tart that tastes of lemon and not of sugar. We do not always get what we prefer. We get what we can hold," Caitlin said. "Exactly," Olenna agreed. "And I prefer to hold my grandchildren. If your husband's decency lets me do so, I will sing of it, quietly and in tune." Stannis stood when the lords were gathered and recited a list of the law that could have been carved on a wall and have done as much good. Men shifted. Some listened with relief. Many listened with the same affection a man reserves for the rope he will use to pull a cart up a hill. Mace Tyrell, who had the good sense to be dull, proposed an exercise in paper. An agreement signed by everyone that the throne was presently contained by a man who held it in trust. Caitlin stood. She was not a lord. She had more presence than most of the lords there. She said, "My husband will hold the throne because the city would burn if he did not. He will step down when you give him a name to kneel before that the realm can swallow without choking to death. If that is Lord Stannis, so be it. If it is another, so be it. If you cannot agree on such a name before the leaves fall, he will call a council at the September of Baelor and unfurl the names of those who will be responsible for the war that breaks out. Then he will pray." There was a sound in the tent then that was not quite a laugh and not quite a murmur of approval. It was the sound men make when psalm. One has put a mirror in front of them and they see their own mouths, not the man they imagine they are. Stannis glared because he could do nothing else. Mace beamed. Olenna looked entertained. When she returned to King's Landing, Caitlin looked thinner and stronger and older and more relieved than Ned would have thought possible. She kissed his cheek in the corridor like a woman kissing a home she had nearly lost and said, "You have made more enemies than I can count." "Their number was never small," Ned said. "I have tried to make friends to balance them." "Tyrell?" she asked. "For now." "Stannis?" "For later." "And Lannister?" "For never," he said simply. Cersei went to her knees in the sept before a stranger statue and said aloud what she had not said in years. "Help me." She did not know to whom. The statue had been worn by more hands than any saint could count and had no face. It felt clean under her fingers and that made her hate it. She rose and told Myrcella to fetch her her comb. When she pulled it through her hair, it snagged once where the seed of a pomegranate had stained days ago. She yanked. It hurt. She liked the hurt. She slept without dreaming. Winter crept down maps. The first snows in the Wolfswood lay like anything pure on the ground men had bled on and made common again. The ravens came less often, as if they had other business. Jon Snow stood on a wall that made the Iron Throne look like a child's chair and watched something old move in the trees. He did not yet have words for it. He had a sword that turned red only with his own training blood, and he had a feeling like knives in the marrow. That the world's argument had shifted to a language no Southerner spoke. Ned held the city. He held it like a father holds a feverish child, firmly, and with a constant hum of fear under everything that thinks. He took his meals when he remembered. He slept when his body forced him. He listened. He listened to Sansa describing Willis Tyrell's letters. Simple, gentle, full of questions about dogs and gardens and a precise humor that had a kindness in it. He listened to Arya describing a new trick of stepping sideways into someone else's weight. He listened to Varys describe the Ironborn's restlessness and the Vale's silence and the small penned-in fury of a father of lions. He listened to Pycelle describe his own ailments with something like delight and then, sometimes, medicine. He listened to the people who came before him because they had nowhere else to say what they needed. He did not like being a king. That was perhaps the single best thing he had going for him. Kept him from enjoying the levers. It made him think about where his hand was when he touched one and where he meant to put it and what would happen if he did. He wrote once more to Stannis, careful every time to respect and not to goad. He wrote to Tywin one last time as well and put it how it was. I have your daughter and her children alive and will keep them so if you do not set the Riverlands afire again. I will try you for treason if you come to this city with a sword. If you do not come, and if you stand down, I will call a council and I will ask the lords to choose a king whose laws you can live under. If you force us, the choice will be made in the shadow of your fires, and it will be made badly." Tywin did not answer, and then, in the 4th week after the battle on the river, he did. With a cartload of half-burned wheat and 100 small bones piled neatly on the stones outside a sept in a nameless village with a bit of poetry attached, in which he said only, "To the king rule." Ned looked at the bones, and at the lines of writing that had been made by a hand that did not shake, and he put the paper down very carefully, because he found he was shaking and he did not want it to be seen. He leaned into the back of the chair that had been Robert's and pretended for 3 breaths to be sleeping so that those in the room would look away. Then he stood and said, "Send to Riverrun, send to Robb, send to Bitterbridge. The Great Council will be held at the Great September in a fortnight. If they will not choose a king for love of the realm, they will choose one to keep from seeing what their cities look like when the west sets the wind." "Will they come?" Varys asked. "They will if they still wish to count themselves men," Ned said. "And if they will not, then I suppose it will be winter." He did not sleep the night before the council. He walked the wall and spoke to the watch and let the wind tangle his hair and thought, in a moment of wild grief, of Winterfell's tower with its warm stones and the way dawn there made frost look like diamonds on the ramparts. He asked himself, not for the first time, if he had broken faith with himself, if the boy who had followed Robert down from the north with a sword like an oath would have looked at this man and spat. He made himself answer as the boy might have, and the answer was, "You kept as many promises as you could, and when keeping one broke another you chose the ones that left the fewest orphans, and if you are not punished for it the gods are lazier than I thought." The Great September of Baelor was not a place that loved him. All that marble, all that light, things that made other men feel they had arrived somewhere sacred made Ned feel he had walked onto a stage he had not rehearsed for. He waited behind the screen and listened to the shuffling of too many silks and the whisper of swords and the creak of the doors, and he told himself stories of snow. Catelyn stood at his shoulder in a dress the color of river water. She took his hand and squeezed once. He felt the strength of her grip and thought, "Whatever else we have made this." They called for silence. The sound that followed silence is always a decision. He stepped out. Cersei was brought in. Not humbled, not broken. A woman who had lost less than she had learned she could bear.
Stannis
Od in a column of light as if it had been arranged for him, and for once he seemed to know the moment loved him and he resented it. Mace Tyrell fanned himself and tried to look as if the song being sung were one he had chosen. Doran Martell's letter lay on a cushion, to be read by a man with a voice like a bell. The small folk pressed in the outer shadows with eyes like coins that had already been spent. Ned said what he had to say. He said that the blood of kings was not always what the world declared it was, and that the law had grown around customs like a rose around a thorn, and that sometimes both needed trimming. He said that the throne was not a stable chair, and that perhaps it needed to be set on a broader foundation. That perhaps it was time for councils to be more than the things men held when they were sick or dying. He said that he would step down for Stannis if the lords would kneel, that he would step down for anyone the lords would kneel for if that person would sit as a servant and not a hungry man. He felt words fall like bread into water and hoped they would thicken the soup. Stannis spoke. He spoke of right and of wrong and of things that did not admit of adjectives. He looked at Cersei and did not flinch. He looked at the Tyrells and did not court them. He looked at the people and said nothing to them at all, as if they were a landscape. He did not lie. In a room like this, it is sometimes a mistake to tell the truth. Cersei spoke. She spoke like a story being told by someone who knows how the audience likes their villains to look. She said nothing and everything, offered nothing and everything, implied that she would prefer to light the city herself rather than watch anyone else take it from her. She made men remember that lions are lovely and that lovely is dangerous. Catelyn spoke and made a thing that was neither a plea nor a command. She made a story of home, of bread, of boys who would not come home if this was done badly. She made a second story of the wall and of things that made men's swords small. She reminded them, gently, that winter comes even to those who do not believe it does. At the end, the lords looked at one another and at the floor and at their hands. They were men with old names and with newer appetites. They had wanted a king they could carry in a box. Ned had refused them that. Stannis offered them an iron. They did not want to hold either. The word council slid between them like a shy animal. They reached for it together. They did what they had never done. They chose not a man but an order. They put it on paper because paper meant they had done something that could be remade if it went wrong. They wrote that the Iron Throne would be held by a king elected from the great houses when succession was contested, and that a council would limit what any one man could do to other men's lives. They wrote it like cowards who had made something brave. They named Stannis heir if the realm would stomach him. They named Ned's regency as an office rather than a man. They sent the words into the world. Ned stood on the steps of the September when it was done. His legs trembled. He realized suddenly that he had not eaten since dawn and had almost no memory of any part of the day that would not rewrite itself in his head into whatever shape he needed it to make sense. Catelyn put her arm through his. "We are not done," she said, very mild. "We are never done," he said. "No," she agreed, "but we are a little less undone." Joffrey came to Ned that evening. He came alone. He came because a boy who will one day be a monster still sometimes longs for a father, even if that father is a man he hates. He stood in the doorway, thin, furious, frightened, and said, "Give it back." In a voice that was almost the voice of a child whose toy has been taken. They both stood very still. Ned said, "I am not keeping it for me." Joffrey said, "You are keeping it from me." And that was truer. Fact like a shard. Ned knelt because sometimes truth needs to be spoken at eye level. "I am keeping it from the fire," he said, "because if you had it, it would be fire. If I am wrong about that, prove me wrong. Later, grow. Make something besides ash." Joffrey trembled as if struck. He left without speaking. In the corridor, the hound guffawed and then choked it off as if ashamed to have made a sound in front of his own anger. The years to come would not be simple. The Reach would flirt with decency and often prefer comfort. Stannis would light beacons and be disgusted no one saw. Tywin would send gifts wrapped in blood and men would call them treaties until they were not. The North would walk to war and back again, and some would not make it either way. Dany, far across the sea, would dream of snow and see not winter but ash, and would wake with dragons that turned what she thought was destiny into hunger. Jon Snow would watch the horizon darken. Arya would find a second coin in a city of canals and forget how she had learned her first dance, and remember and forget again. Sansa would learn to draw a map of a garden that included places no one else noticed. The shadow under a certain hedge where one could hear the entire keep if one leaned right. The place where the stones were warmer, proof of a secret hearth under the wall. The hound would ride away one day without telling anyone where he was going and come back because a dog who has found a decent house sometimes needs to stand on the porch even if he will never be invited inside. Barristan would keep being what he had always been and, one day, be needed for it. Varys would count and count and count and one day stop. On a night 2 summers later, Ned would sit again in the Godswood and hear, very faintly, a wind that sounded like it had learned the word north. He would put his hand on the weirwood and feel nothing in the bark but tree, and that would be enough. He would go to bed next to a woman who smelled of river water and bread, and would not sleep quickly because kings rarely do, even the reluctant ones. He would dream of a tower and a blue flower as he always did, but this time Lyanna laughed, not crying, and asked him if he had tried not being honorable for a day and if that had helped. He would tell her no, that he had tried a different honor instead, a heavier one. She would touch his cheek with a cold hand and say he had always been meant to carry heavy things. In the morning he would wake and put on his plain clothes and eat porridge with a king's spoon. He would go out to hear a woman's petition about a neighbor's hog that had rooted her fence. He would think, this is what kings do when they can. And somewhere, far away, winter would be walking on long legs, untroubled by papers and votes and boats, thinking only of the way it prefers all sound to stop. For now, there was a city that did not burn. For now, the throne did not bite too deeply. For now, a man who had not wanted to be a king tried the more difficult thing, to be a patient one. That, more than swords or oaths, was the change. The sense that it might be possible to build a season between summers where men remembered mercy. It would not last. Nothing did, but he would set his hand to it while it was there, and in that stubborn, plain act was the only answer he had ever had to men like Tywin, and to boys like Joffrey, and to Winter. Not victory, but refusal to stop placing stones in a river until the far bank could be reached, even if he never set foot on it himself.